For a while there, Nokia wasn't just a company, they were, well, a fact of life. If you had a mobile phone back in the early 2000s, chances are it was a Nokia. They were this unstoppable, innovative giant that literally dominated the world. And then, poof, it felt like they vanished overnight. So, how in the world did the king of mobile phones lose its crown so fast? Let's get into it.
Just take a look at this number, 49%, in 2007. And that's the same year the very first iPhone came out. Nokia had a staggering 49% of the entire global smartphone market. That's not a lead, that is absolute command. Think about that. 1 out of every 2 smartphones sold, anywhere on the planet, was a Nokia. That's just wild.
And this is where it gets really interesting when you put it in perspective. Look at Apple, the company we now think of as this huge revolutionary force. Back then, they were just a tiny 5% blip on the radar. BlackBerry was a solid competitor at 10%, sure, but Nokia was in a completely different league. They were playing a different game entirely.
So the million-dollar question is, how does a company with that much power, that huge of a lead, with all those resources, just fall off a cliff? It's one of the biggest puzzles in modern business history, and the answer, it turns out, is way more complicated than you'd think.
Now, the easy answer, the one everyone goes to, is, oh, the iPhone came along. But a really groundbreaking study, one that actually interviewed dozens of Nokia's top and middle managers, found that the real problem wasn't the competition. The fatal wound was self-inflicted, born from a really toxic culture inside the company.
What researchers found was that the whole organization was basically paralyzed by this deep emotional divide. It was a tale of 2 very powerful but completely different kinds of fear that were basically at war with each other. And understanding this conflict is the key to everything that happened next. So, on one hand, you've got the top brass, the C-suite folks. Their eyes were glued to the outside world. They were terrified of Google, of Apple, of falling behind, and they were terrified of their shareholders if the quarterly numbers looked bad. But then you have the middle managers, and their fear, it wasn't pointed outside the company. It was pointed straight up at their own bosses. And this quote just nails the feeling of that external fear. This is a top manager remembering the moment a Google founder explained their cloud strategy. So on the outside, he's keeping his cool, smiling. But inside, he's basically thinking, oh, shoot, we are in so much trouble. He saw this massive threat to Nokia's entire way of doing business, and it scared him to death. Okay, so now flip that coin over. Here's the internal fear. This middle manager knew a project timeline was, in his words, insanely optimistic. But the actual physical fear of just speaking up and challenging his superior was so intense that it literally silenced him. He wasn't scared for the company's future, he was scared of his own boss. That's a huge difference. So, you gotta ask, where does a fear like that come from? Well, it turns out it started at the very, very top. The chairman was famous for his aggressive, temperamental style. People who were interviewed for the studies said he would just shout people down in front of everyone. And these stories, they spread like wildfire, right? They became legends inside the company, creating a culture where bringing bad news to your boss was seen as a career-ending move. Okay, so you've got these 2 massive opposing fears just tearing the company apart. And this didn't just cause a simple communication breakdown. No, it created this toxic, vicious cycle. Not just a lack of communication, but active misinformation that would eventually doom the company. So let's walk through how this death spiral actually worked. Step 1. A top manager, terrified of what Apple is doing, demands a new phone, and he wants it fast. Step 2. The middle manager, terrified of that top manager, says, yes, sir, even though he knows the software is a complete mess. He hides the problems. Step 3. The top manager gets a nice, clean report saying everything's on schedule. And step 4, that leader, feeling relieved, goes on to make huge strategic decisions based on a total fantasy. I mean, this quote from someone who was actually there, it says it all, doesn't it? Demands and pressure came downhill just fine. But the really important, honest information about delays and problems, it never made it back up. The people at the top were basically flying blind because their own employees were too scared to tell them the truth. And what all this created was something the researchers call an assessment gap. Basically, it's this huge growing canyon between what the executives thought the company could do and the buggy, delayed, harsh reality the engineers were actually struggling with every single day. So this giant gap between perception and reality, it had absolutely catastrophic consequences for Nokia's strategy. It led to a crippling case of short-term thinking. They got so hooked on hearing good news right now that they became totally blind to the massive problems waiting for them down the road.
It led to a condition that the study calls temporal myopia. It's a bit of a fancy term, but all it really means is being dangerously short-sighted. All the company's energy, all its resources went into hitting that next quarterly target, even if it meant completely sacrificing the long-term health of their technology.
And here is the perfect and honestly most painful example of this in action. Everybody at Nokia knew their operating system, Symbian, was ancient and clunky. They knew they needed to build something totally new, but that would take years, right? So instead, because they were so afraid of missing short-term goals, they just kept slapping more and more band-aids on their old system to rush the next phone out the door, making the core problem worse every single time.
And you can literally watch the disaster unfold in their product releases. The N95 in 2007? A masterpiece, a huge hit. Then their first touchscreen phone, massively delayed. Then the N97, which one of their own top managers called a total fiasco. And finally, their supposed iPhone killer, the N8, was so late to the party, it was just irrelevant. The internal sickness was now on full display for every customer to see.
And if you need a smoking gun, this quote is it. A top boss was genuinely surprised that their huge new phone was a flop. He said it was a cold shower. Can you believe that? A surprise to him, maybe, but for the middle managers and engineers who were too afraid to speak up, it was a disaster they had seen coming for months.
So when you pull it all together, what's the big lesson here? What really brought Nokia down? It wasn't about the hardware or the software. It was about psychology.
This table really breaks down the whole domino effect. It all starts with those conflicting fears. That leads to distorted information, which causes short-sighted decisions, that temporal myopia. And the final result of all that? A total collapse in the quality and innovation that had made them the kings in the first place. So what's the takeaway for all of us? What can we learn from this? Well, first, the biggest threat isn't always outside. Sometimes the monster is inside the building. You simply cannot innovate if your people are afraid to tell the truth. Creating an environment where people feel safe to bring up bad news, that's not some fluffy HR concept. It is a hardcore strategic necessity if you want to survive. And that really leaves us with one last and maybe most important question. And this is one to take back to your own world. It's easy to sit here and judge Nokia, but we should probably all look in the mirror. In your team, at your company, what happens when someone has bad news? Is it treated as a gift, a chance to fix a problem early, or is the messenger punished? Because as the story of Nokia shows us, an organization that is too scared to hear the truth, well, it's an organization that's already failing.